Thank you, everybody, for great questions. I'm not worried that you're not paying attention. Let me introduce our other esteemed colleague from Colorado, Judy Dettmer. Judy's been working in the field of brain injury for over 25 years. Well, long over 25 years. I've known Judy for at least 25 years. She's currently the director for the brain injury program at the Colorado Department of Human Services. And there she oversees all activities related to both the Colorado Traumatic Brain Injury Trust Fund program, as well as a federal grant funded through the Health and Human Services Administration for Community Living Agency. We don't have a trust fund, but we do have the Administration for Community Living grant, partly because of Judy's work at the national level. She works extensively with adults, children, and family members of people with brain injury, and she's provided direct and systems consultations to impact the lives of people with brain injury across the country. Judy's recognized by her colleagues in brain injury across the country as really an eminent leader in systems change for brain injury. In fact, one of the phrases that gets thrown around with Judy is that she is kind of Switzerland. When there are organizations that are having conflict or turf wars, you bring Judy in, and she's that neutral territory, that neutral personality that's able to help people find win-win solutions. She has benefited us all with that skill set as your immediate past president of the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators Board of Directors, and at NASHA, she's facilitated a great deal of progress at the federal level for brain injury. So we're very grateful for you coming and sharing some of your knowledge about what works in Colorado. Please welcome Judy.
I know, I feel like I'm at high noon shootout. This sun's not coming. Oh, there it goes. Okay, you guys hear me?
Ooh.
Okay, that's funny because I can't hear me.
Okay.
You already heard Karen coughing, but I have a sinus infection and an ear infection. Oh. Yay, double bonus. So you all sound like I'm laying in a bathtub with my head under the water. That's how you guys sound when you're talking. When I'm talking in my head, I sound like I have my head in a tin can. So anyways, a lot of fun. So I apologize in advance. I do have a cough drop in my mouth. Karen will be interpreting the questions. I used to know sign language, but best I could offer right now is maybe singing White Christmas, because my sister and I learned that as kids. So I'll try not to do that to you. Okay, so I'm going to jump in, and the first part of this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about infrastructure building in terms of what we should think about with working with kids with brain injury. And although this is a conference dedicated to concussion, there are those kids who do not recover from concussion, and so we need to think about kind of that system or infrastructure covering the gamut from concussion to those who recover with concussion, to those who have protracted recovery, to those who will have lifelong impairment related to their concussion. So I'm going to do that in the context of Colorado, but there are some similarities between our states, and there could be some crossover in how Iowa wants to think about addressing this need across the continuum. So these are just some milestones in terms of dates and times. And so when you think of brain injury in the context of disability, brain injury is a really young disability. I mean, in the 1970s, mid-70s is really when medical advancements were happening to save the lives of people with severe brain injury. We didn't even have mild brain injury on our radar until, I don't know, in the 90s, I would say that started to become something we all were thinking about. And so in reality, thinking about infrastructure building and how do we address this in departments of ed, how do we address this in departments of health or human services, as well as our alliances, et cetera, we're pretty young in that thinking. So some of the things that really have elevated brain injury in the world of youth with brain injury is in 1991, it became its own disability category with special education. And that kind of tipped off a lot of training around brain injury, some work around development of brain injury teams, and Jeff referenced Sue Pearson earlier, who is really a pioneer in that area of brain injury team development, and someone that the rest of us states kind of look toward is Iowa in terms of these teams and how do we think about this in our schools. The Tbi Act that passed not to get political, but if you're at all political, talk to ACL about not getting rid of our TBI Act. We can talk about that later if you're interested. Jeff and I will have information for you. In Colorado specifically, we pass our trust fund legislation, and I know that's something I was just talking to Jeff earlier, something that might be a consideration for Iowa, and I'll talk more about what that legislation is and what it did for us. And then I won't go through all of it, but some of the other really important milestones is some of the best systems change happens accidentally or you stumble into it. And that is true for us in Colorado in terms of our changing our IDEA, our special education eligibility criteria. Our head of school nursing came to us, Karen and I, and some other folks who had been working in kids' pediatric brain injury, and said, hey, we're looking at what should the eligibility be for brain injury related to special ed. And up until that time, it had always been you needed medical documentation for proof that you had a brain injury and an educational concern. Obviously, that will always be part of that. But those of you who work in brain injury or in the schools, you know how hard it is to get that medical documentation, and especially for those kids with more mild brain injury. So if you're thinking about someone who's had a concussion that's not recovering from that concussion, maybe have had multiple concussions or complicated concussions, but haven't been to the level of hospitalization, people don't have that medical documentation. And so we work to change our definition of eligibility to say medical documentation and or credible history of brain injury. So an educational identification of brain injury. So we're going to talk a little bit about our model, but okay, so with that, I'm just going to say that triggered a bunch of training for our school districts. And then about 3 years later, we realized, oh, we didn't really have the authority just to do that. Oops. But guess what? Everybody had been practicing that way. It was going well. And so when it came time to change our rules effectively and for real and officially, we already had all the background for it. So it was like a justification to change the rules. So it worked out really well in 2014 when we changed the rules. So just keep those dates in mind. We're going to go through kind of a little bit of the model. So my program, I am the Maggie Ferguson of Colorado. I work at Department of Human Services, which is our lead state agency on brain injury. As yours is Department of Health. And basically, as Jeff had mentioned, what that does for me is I administer our federal grant. We also are asked to do technical assistance and capacity building across state agencies specifically, but just across other entities in Colorado. So it kind of gives me a golden key to say, hey, we're the lead state agency on brain injury. Wouldn't you like to understand brain injury? Well, that used to be my life. Now it's people call me. Hey, I hear you do training on brain injury. Can we get some support? It's kind of an amazing shift that's happened in our world. And then the trust fund. So through our trust fund, we have client services, which is case management, and I'll talk about that in context of kids in a second. We do research, so we put out formal requests for proposals, and then we do education on brain injury. What that did for us, so what we do is collect surcharges on DUI, DWAI, and speeding convictions, and those funds go to me and divided across those three areas as I mentioned. So for services, what we were able to do is leverage our trust fund dollars to develop an interagency agreement with our Department of Education. We started with the federal grant to hire someone to prove again, and it was actually Karen that we hired, which was probably the smartest thing ever on the planet. But and I told her, okay, there's all these goals, yada, 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 yada. The only goal I really care about is that you get in there and prove to them why they need a person at Department of Ed to be focused on brain injury. And so she succeeded at that. So now that grant's been over 4 years, and we have a full-time person at Department of Ed that sits under special education that our Department of Ed pays for to be a brain injury consultant. She splits her time between brain injury and FASD, fetal alcohol syndrome or spectrum. So, but then in partnership, we use our trust fund dollars to pay for an additional FTE. So we have 2 FTE in Colorado that sit at our Department of Ed as brain injury consultants. So that's just an example of leveraging those trust fund dollars to think about bigger picture, not just direct services and supports. So What we do, oh, that's really hard to read. What we do with those dollars and the expectation at the Department of Ed is that we want that person to work on building capacity of school personnel. So not one person can be in every school. I mean, those of you in the schools know how that works. So we're looking at how do we develop that capacity. Providing that in-service and consultation support, developing guidelines and protocols for effectively working with youth with brain injury, and the developing and monitoring appropriate policies, related to supporting students with brain injury. So I'm not going to go into each of those, but just highlight a few things. In terms of guidelines and protocols, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's available on the website. We wrote it many, many years ago, but this person is responsible for helping to keep it updated and edited, and she uses professionals like Karen and other folks in our world in Colorado to help update this content. But it's a pretty comprehensive guide for educators. It could also be used for parents, family members, in terms of how to understand brain injury and how to support kids with brain injury in the context of education. And then we also have our concussion management guidelines, which Karen authored originally when she was in that position. And ironically, in Colorado, because there's 2 children's hospitals, which creates a little bit of a political dynamic for our Department of Ed, Department of Ed has taken a neutral stance and can't really say, well, we adopt REAP in full, because it was adopted by one specific hospital. But in reality, that's what these concussion guidelines are all about, are all the principles of the REAP management. So when you look at that, you're going to see REAP all over it, just not name that in Colorado. In terms of infrastructure, we have a brain injury advisory team for education, and we have a component of both educators as well as folks who work at our our program for special needs. Is anybody with the Department of Health here working Title V? No, okay. Well, every health department has Title V dollars that help support care coordination and support for kids with special health care needs. We have done a significant amount of partnering with our HCP office, and they're part of this advisory team. We also have a concussion action team, which again, Karen developed, so I don't know why I'm giving this part of the talk, but she did this. We call it the CAT team. Anyway, so they do calls and they call them cat calls, literally. So they do cat calls every month, and they provide updates and discussion about current research and legislation. It's just a way to keep school district staff informed about what's happening with concussion across the state and across the nation. And then they have a listserv, and so it's a way to communicate effectively with them. In terms of capacity building, this is the part that we're just kind of formally bringing together, and that's where having a position at Department of Ed has been critical. Some of us who have been doing this a long time, trying to do it kind of as a voluntary, on the side, hey, let's develop these teams in our school districts, all these volunteers in the school districts on these brain injury teams. You can only take that so far. Having someone embedded in Department of Ed who's really focused on this helps to formalize and really increase the reach of the work we were trying to do. So that's what we're working on now. We started in the fall of 2015, a few of us around the table kind of chatting about what would this look like. And then by fall, our spring 2016, we started to really more formalize what this would look like. You see a theme there, brain steps. And I'll talk about that more. By spring of 2016, we really had some buy-in from both our Department of Ed, but also just school districts and with our consultants at Department of Ed. So that's when we developed the Brain Steps model, or we partnered with Pennsylvania, who actually were the original developers of this model, to bring that to Colorado. And you guys have brain injury resource teams here, is that what they're called, Jeff? Yep. That Sue basically started, but that I think are continuing. And this is just a way to formalize those teams through this model. So basically what those are, and it all, I like how one letter and everything got squished into a different, or into the circle. But anyway, so basically you have the teams, and they're multidisciplinary teams in the school district, made up of school district personnel In Pennsylvania, they include family members as well as some outside neuropsychologists. But you can kind of see the makeup of the teams and the variety of professionals that we're hoping will comprise these teams. Basically, what we're asking, this is the formalized part, is we get a letter of agreement from the school district saying that the person is able and that they're supported in participating on this brain injury team, because it's all voluntary, unfortunately, but that's what it is. So they already have that administrative buy-in. We provide training both in the fall and the spring, yearly updates, and then just ongoing kind of communication and support for the teams through our brain injury consultant. And then you can see kind of what the different trainings are related to. But again, it's just a way to kind of formalize that support process for these teams, and then hopefully supporting kids with brain injury. An important thing to understand is Brain Steps is meant to support kids who have ongoing brain injury. So it's not nimble enough to support kids with concussion. We'll talk about concussion in a minute. This is more for that protracted recovery or for those kids who are not recovering fully. So there's a website that everybody logs on to. We have a database that we store our information in so that everybody's kind of following a protocol and same process. It's for any kid with a brain injury. Even though our special ed criteria is for traumatic brain injury specifically, we know that there's kids who have had a non-traumatic injury such as a stroke, an aneurysm, brain tumor, some other mechanism of injury that have similar needs to those kids with traumatic brain injury. So even though they wouldn't qualify under special education under traumatic brain injury, they might qualify under something else. We want these teams to be able to support those kids as well, because if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's likely a duck. And that's the truth with brain injury, whether it's traumatic or non-traumatic. We also, in terms of concussion, we don't take kids who have had a concussion into the Brain Steps model until 6 or 8 weeks post-concussion, because we're looking for those kids to fit into Brain Steps who are not recovering fully. Not those kids who are going to recover, because that takes a different approach, as Karen will go into more detail about, but I'll talk about briefly here. Okay, so just wrapping up, well, it doesn't go backwards. Said that already. So Brain Steps, moderate to severe or ongoing related to a brain injury, is meant to serve those kids long-term into their school career. For concussion, we're doing concussion management teams. This is more of an acute model, and so they're nimble, they're more flexible in terms. Brain Steps is school district level, concussion management teams are school level. And so what we're looking for is 2 people to be on that team. So it's not really, I don't know, it's a team more than 2, but it's a dyad. So we have an academic monitor, and Karen talked a little bit about that with the REAP model, and a symptom monitor. So people that tend to be on these teams are school nurses, school psychologists, counselors, folks like that who can know those 2 different sides of the student. So obviously an academic monitor monitors academics, and there's different tools that the concussion management teams have available to them to help monitor this. They're monitoring symptoms over time, and obviously what they're looking for is this child resolving in their symptoms? Are the appropriate academic adjustments being made to help support that student? And if they don't get through that and recover without having ongoing symptoms and impairments, that's when we're going to start thinking about Brain Steps. So again, there's some training that goes into it for these different teams. That's kind of what they're working on, is providing that consultation. This is all stuff you have available to you. So to point out again how these kind of play together. So the student has concussion. The first layer is this concussion management team. So it's the team that is looking at symptom monitoring, academic monitoring over that first 6 weeks or so, hopefully only over about a 3-week period until they recover. If a student is not recovering, that's when the second layer begins, and that's when it kicks over to the Brain Steps team for ongoing support and monitoring. So modeling again, very much after REAP, these are kind of how the teams look with our concussion management teams, the players in our concussion management teams, and who is surrounding that student with a concussion. We're trying to get input from medical professionals, school team, parents, athletic. Sound familiar? It sounds just like what Karen was talking about with REAP. That's the same model we're using. And if they don't resolve in 6 to 8 weeks, then we're looking at brain steps involvement. The other critical component to this infrastructure is thinking outside of just the school boundaries and looking to community support. And that's where the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado gets involved. Now again, with our trust fund, we're lucky because we're able to support case management support through our Brain Injury Alliance, as well as education consultation. So what we have is a team of case managers who serve our entire state. They're able to work with the family and the youth and the schools to think about what are the community resources this youth or child needs. Oftentimes we make that referral to HCP for any kind of medical type case management. They are more medically focused. But the other key component to our model is education consultant. So the education consultant works directly with families and kids to develop, to think about what are the educational needs specifically of this youth. So even though we have brain step teams involved, this person's able to do more one-on-one interaction with the youth and with the family and guide the school teams as well. And we're really lucky in Colorado because the person in that position right now is a former school psychologist. And so she knows schools and how they work inside and out. So we feel very fortunate to have her on board. And then the last kind of infrastructure piece is that we have a group called the Brain Injury Network, our Brain Injury Professional Network. And in Colorado, we have a pediatric VIPN who focuses, we meet quarterly, and we focus on issues specific to kids because honestly, those issues can be very different. And we need to be thinking about not kids as miniature adults, but kids as kids and what their specific needs are and the kind of supports that we have to develop for them. So that's just kind of a really quick and dirty overview of infrastructure in Colorado. I'm definitely happy to take questions now or after Karen talks. So she's going to get more into kind of the in-depth about how to support kids. Do you think, Jeff, now or?
Let's take a few minutes just to see if there is a question here. Somebody has a question.
And don't forget, I'll need an interpreter.
Fair enough. Okay.
Silence. Give us a minute while we shift out high noon.
That was good.
Hear me? All right. So, try this again. I have my cough drops. I have 3 glasses of water back here. I'm so sorry about earlier. So I'll hopefully get through this one without a coughing attack. All right, so you can tell from what Judy's saying, in the state of Colorado, Judy is the mastermind of all things brain injury. And she has created this whole infrastructure. All I do is that I get to come in and fill in the content. That's primarily my role pretty much now as we move forward. So there are kind of 2 hats that I wear. I am a consultant at the Colorado Department of Education, and there I focus on moderate to severe brain injury. And the content that I'm going to show you is the content that we have developed that we go out and train our school districts on related services providers. So speech, language, OT, PTs, school psychologists, counselors, for how would you start the process of gathering enough data to determine if there is educational impact from a traumatic brain injury if you have medical documentation and/or credible history. You still have to determine the educational impact. So I will show you that whole content of how we go across the state through all kinds of winter storms and we've been through everything to get these trainings out, how our school districts would have the tools available to determine educational impact from brain injury. But the other hat that I wear with Rocky Mountain Hospital for Children is on that front end of a concussion, which is a brain injury. It's just a short-term, temporary brain injury. And so many of the things that work, that we look at or focus on with moderate to severe brain injury, you can kind of take and do some of that training in your concussion management. And while Brain Steps is not concussion management training, it has a small module that does a little bit of kind of what you've heard today about what is a brain injury, kind of the basic symptoms. It doesn't go into very much depth with that. And then you kick into the Brain Steps modules or training, which is moderate to severe. And Pennsylvania uses the same content that I'm going to show you today, the content that we've developed in Colorado. And so Brenda, who runs the Brain Steps program in Pennsylvania, she and I like to say, REAP is the first 4 weeks, Brain Steps is beyond that. But really a lot of the same content, it all makes sense because the same kinds of areas get impacted with brain injury, whether it's mild and short-term or moderate, severe, long-term. So let me show you that content area. And all of it is, we try to make it as easy as possible. So here's your easy button. It's all on cokidswithbraininjury.com. And this is all available to you guys, and you can use it or with your teams, download it, however you want to do that. So go to cokidswithbraininjury.com, and when you get there, you want to look at the brain injury matrix. So this is what cokidswithbraininjury.com looks like. There are buttons there to kind of navigate the different different resources that we have on there. And so you can also have your parents go there for resources if they want some more information. All the manuals that Judy has shown you are downloadable here or through our Colorado Department of Education. The matrix that I'm going to show you is go kind of click around through the educators and you will find the matrix that corresponds and correlates with our special education eligibility. Now, we realize that different states have different eligibility than ours. And so you would have to kind of adjust the use of our matrix with your eligibility. But everything that we have created on the CoKids website in terms of what kinds of assessments might you use to look at, to determine if there's educational impact of a brain injury, are all things that school people can give. We did not put on there things that you had to be, have the extra credentialing in neuropsychology or have an outside brain injury certification, because we want our school people to be able to navigate and use any and all of the different tests on here. It's how you use your tests and how you ask your questions that make a difference in terms of whether you can determine if there's a body of evidence for educational impact. And of course, the reason you do the assessments is that then you're going to want to make your interventions fit specifically with your assessments. So if you don't ask the right questions, you won't be able to provide the right interventions. And so what we've done is through our steering committee, which are a group of school-based as well as community-based pediatric brain injury specialists. We've been meeting for years. We have been kind of pulling together our thoughts of what are the building blocks that are necessary for normal development of just good, healthy brain development. And we've kind of borrowed from other models out there, and we've come up with 4 different levels, basically. The foundational levels or fundamental levels of the things that are usually the first to develop with brain maturity, as well as are the most basic, and usually the most sensitive to impact when you have any kind of a brain injury, whether it be concussion or moderate to severe. you tend to see memory, processing speed, attentional issues. Those are the things that tend to get impacted first and quickest. Normal development, then, if you have a good, strong, healthy foundation, then on top of that, you begin to build language, learning, visual, spatial. So think about your, toddlers and your own kids as they're, growing and learning, kind of brain development kind of goes in that order. Eventually, then, they begin to develop really good social competency. So, all of the rules of taking turns and playing games, and then the executive function rules, which are initiation and organization and planning and judgment and all the things that we want our kids to eventually develop. That comes a little bit later, right? It takes a while for these to develop, which is why you don't leave your kid home alone until they're a certain age where they can handle that. They don't get the car keys till they're 16, because executive functioning and social competency are higher order development. And so it takes a while and a solid, strong, healthy lower base to get to that point. And eventually, what we really want all of our kids to learn, achievement, reading, writing, math, what are their work skills, what are their college skills, what are their keeping a checkbook skills, all of those things. That's that part there, the purple part on the top. But often as educators, that's the part we look at first, right? We do standardized testing, we're looking at reading, writing, and math. And for a lot of our kids, not only with traumatic or acquired brain injury or fetal alcohol or ADHD or mental health problems, we might have some shaky areas underneath. But if you just look at normal, typical development, you want this to be as solid as possible. So starting there, these are our building blocks of brain development. And this is what we need to have a productive citizen. So we're all focusing on this. If you take this, and let's say you have a brain injury, and one of the most common impacts of brain injury is it impacts attention. You take that out, what will that do to your building blocks and everything else that develops on top of it? It all begins to crumble. And so for us as parents, as educators, as coaches, as athletic trainers, you see kids who have subtle attention or subtle minor, maybe multiple concussions, and it tends to impact attention, processing speed, memory. Some of these things are, at the time they were impacted. You assume they get better. But what if there's a cumulative effect and they're not getting better? And now you have a kid who's not learning very well. A kid who is not making good judgments. A kid who can't complete a project when they used to be able to do so. So those could be the subtle impacts of ongoing mild traumatic brain injuries. They're definitely the obvious impacts of more moderate to severe brain injury. So we started this with our teams because they all resonate with this. As educators, they know all about attention. They know all about memory. They know how these things impact learning because they've seen it with kids with learning issues or attention deficit disorder or fetal alcohol. And we just take brain injury and put it into the language that feels comfortable to them. And you can kind of take concussion and take it and put it into the language that feels comfortable to them. And then they understand why it is that kid can't initiate or finish a project, why they're not making good judgments, why they have social, incompetency, rather than what is wrong with this kid, and the anger and the frustration of assuming everything is in place. So if we start from this model then, we are then able to help our educators and our parents understand that each one of these, if you lose or disrupt any of these areas, you begin to see effects that may look like this. And so for each area, we kind of listed it all out. What does it look like if you have problems with attention? And many of our teachers or school professionals, when you're working with them, they'll say, oh yes, I have kids like that. I just assumed it was a bad kid. I just assumed it was a kid who didn't want to do his work. But it could be attention. So I'll zip through these really quickly. They will be in your handouts. We left them in there because we figured you'd rather have them than not. But I'm not going to hit every slide because you guys can read and just kind of give you an example. This is what attention would look like if it got impacted. This is what inhibition is a separate part of attention that we really focus on, because if you cannot inhibit a response, generally it's hard to then teach or do anything else. So the inability to inhibit becomes a big behavioral problem and learning problem, and it's part of attention. And so you see that most commonly with kids with any level of traumatic brain injuries, attention and inhibition gets impacted. You see that with adults as well. And those are the kinds of things that get these folks into trouble behaviorally and with the law. So this is what inhibition, lack of inhibition would look like, processing speed, memory, sensory motor. And it goes on, you know, this, let me stop here for a minute. We focus a lot on those orange foundational levels because those are the quickest to be impacted by a concussion or brain injury, and generally the most impactful in making the rest of everything kind of shaky, okay? But there are some that just get impacted on the next level, which are these green levels. So language can be impacted, learning can be impacted, and then social-emotional. These all look like behaviors to many of our parents and teachers, but they really might be impacted neurological or brain-based issues. So, let me zip through the rest of these.
Karen, you're talking, up here, I look up there and I see my teenagers in every slide. Help me understand how to discern neurodevelopmental appropriate behaviors from post-concussive weirdness.
Good question. So the question is, these all fit for your typical teenager as well, right? So how do you tell the difference between whether there's an injury and it's a brain injury, or it's just teenagerhood? And you don't, except for whether or not there's actually been a hit to the head or some kind of an insult. That's why in the building blocks, social competency and executive function are almost to the top. If you were looking at age, we would be saying that that's, you know, the foundational levels are probably birth, toddlerhood, then you get into the green levels, which are kind of elementary into middle school, and you don't expect the kids to get to the blue level with good executive functioning or social competency until about the high school years. And some reach them quicker than others. And that is why if you were to go rent a car, I have heard that they do not bring down the car insurance for boys until the age of 25, because in theory their executive function on a typical kid, not a kid with a brain injury, are not well developed until the age of 25. So there's debate about boys having slower executive functioning than girls. But yeah, and then you've got that productive citizen, right, which is what, 25 or 30 years old on the top. So you're right, there's time and there's development with all of this. And then any of these things that get impacted. But imagine if you had a brain injury at the age of 6 and you didn't, and it impacted your ability to inhibit a response in everything you thought you said. And now you're 16 and you're still having this problem with inhibition. You can see how that's then going to impact everything else, all of your social competency and your executive functioning. So that's kind of how that works. We, as parents, we're all, you know, we just cross our fingers and hold on, right? And hope they go through all the rest of these building blocks. But any kind of neurological insult, whether that's acquired or traumatic, or mental health issues or trauma, or any of those other things, are going to impact the shakiness, the solidness at the bottom. So, okay, so what we did is we took these building blocks and said, okay, this is what we all aspire to. But if we're going to have to drill down and find out why this kid is coming to my attention, maybe there was an incident, there was a report of a brain injury, or even mental health issues or something. They're coming to us, and we're trying to figure out where there might be areas of delay or non-development or getting stuck. What we did with the matrix was we looked at all the different assessments school professionals can give, and we put them in the right areas. So this is just an example Here would be an example of some different tests that school professionals can give if you're looking at particular areas. And once you have drilled it down, here are some different interventions. If you find there are areas of deficit in any of these, here's now how you would start to put your interventions in place. And what this did or does is it gives our professionals, our school professionals, the tools they need to drill down to figure out how any disruptions neurologically or brain-based have taken these kids off, and what interventions we might use to start to build that back up again, if we can remediate or if we can compensate. And it gives our school people a different lens to look at, instead of just saying, what is wrong with this kid? He's not learning. What is wrong with this kid? He's not behaving. So that's basically what the matrix does. And for any one of these areas, you can go and drill down. There are more assessments than I can list here. There are way more interventions than I can list here. That book, Manual for Educators, that is about 80 pages long. It is full of interventions, more than I could ever put on slides here for you. So if you are working with a kid, or you are a parent, or you have a kid who is having slow processing speed, just go and find the interventions in there, and they're going to be applicable whether it came from a brain injury or not. Okay? There's also in the manual a whole list of different behaviors that you can start with. So let's say you don't know if it's a processing speed disorder or a memory disorder. You don't have to know that right off the bat. You answer these questions for how this might, how Johnny looks to you. He's having trouble concentrating, he's having trouble in his seat. Check, 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 and see where they cluster. And that gives you direction of where you would start your assessment, because it gives you the highest suspicion of the areas of concern. So that's also in there, this functional observation. So, for example, here are different kinds of assessments you can give, and we just randomly threw some out there for you. And then interventions, like I said, there's more of the interventions in there in this book. And then here are some examples of interventions based upon where you find the areas of concern. So the point of all of this is it helps to basically do capacity building for our school educators, so that they are not feeling like, I know this kid had a brain injury, I'm waiting for them to drive to a big city, get a neuropsychologist evaluation. Maybe they can't afford that. Maybe it's 6 months out before that can happen. What can we do in schools to start to assess it and intervene? And it all has to do with, how you intervene is going to be based upon the lens that you use of what you think the problem is. So if the behavior that comes to you is non-compliance, but you believe it could be now due to a number of reasons, like receptive language, or expressive language, or it's a problem with attention, or it's a problem with memory, or it's a problem with visual spatial cues, or executive dysfunction. And you see this in how many settings? 1, 2, 3 settings. And you know some things about this kid's setting events. Maybe the kid is gluten intolerant. Maybe the kid is prone to absent seizures. Those are setting events that are also going to impact the child's ability to behave. And they're all neurologically based. If you are thinking wider than this kid is just not complying, which is where many of our parents and teachers start, you then have so many different interventions and ways that you can support this child. And it basically is treatment versus punishment. And that's really what it comes down to. Are we giving this kid the best chance to succeed at school versus just suspensions or other things that perhaps we hadn't considered? So this just gives you many different options to think about and to create your body of evidence. It may lead to special education, it may not. That's not necessarily the purpose of this. And when you think about it with concussion, what do we mostly see with these complicated factors of concussion? These issues, which are supposed to be short-term and transient, are still going to get better, but they often lead to mental fatigue, processing speed problems, poor memory, difficulty learning, and what does that sound exactly like? Our foundational skills, the orange level. And so if you apply all of that back here to this, you take any of those out, even short term, 1 to 4 weeks of concussion, processing speed or memory, it's going to impact their choices, their executive functioning for a short amount of time. And that's, I mean, you would just expect everything to be on a smaller scale unless they don't get better and it goes into 4 weeks, then you're still already halfway there in supporting them with your interventions as you move forward. Because I mean, mostly what I would say that is impacted with the concussion is mental fatigue, short-term and processing speed, which is going to impact for the teachers instruction, grades, and tests and work output. And then that takes you back to exactly what I showed you earlier with REAP. This is how teachers would support for mental fatigue, for processing speed, and for difficulty learning new material. So it runs the whole gamut from mild, moderate to severe. You just have to think about where you're applying it and whether it's short term, whether it's in very small amounts, or whether it really is a student who actually has educational impact enough to qualify for your special education services. Here is how you would support them long term. But all of that is on the website. All of it is downloadable to you guys. You can take this back to your teams. You can share it with family members or whatever, and start to just be thinking about less of just being, frustrated or bewildered about why our kids do certain things, and maybe drilling it down to some areas where we could start to do some interventions with them, because we're going to spend that time with them anyways. We might as well do it in a teaching manner instead of a consequence manner, if at all possible. So here are some websites that that you can go to and supports all the things that we've been talking about. This is a community of practice, which NASHA, NICB, National Collaboration on Children's Brain Injury, which is a group of national pediatric experts work together and have this website up that you guys can go to. It's free, and you can download resources. They're always putting new things up here so that you can get on there and check it out. And more websites for your consideration. Okay. All right, any questions? For me or for Judy?
There's one.
You talk about processing speed being important. Around here reading, more people at baseline and impact. What's your opinion on baseline and like King Devitt test for getting the processing speed?
So the question is my assessment on
Use the King Devitt test before.
well, we have looked at it, but my understanding with the King Devitt was that it did not have baseline component. Is that so?
There's a lot of places that actually are starting to do a baseline on them.
Oh.
So that you get the baseline what their speed should be. And then later on, if there is an incident, you actually then have
So you have the basis for
you have
comparison.
a basis for comparison.
Yeah, when we looked at the King Devitt, they haven't had like the baseline norms and that whole separate thing. So we, as a clinic, have stayed away from it. And Impact does have its own norms for baseline and that whole process. So we haven't used the King Devitt. But there's definitely Impact, King Devitt. There's even the ruler test, right? Have you heard of the reaction test with the ruler, where you drop the ruler and how fast they catch it? There are all these fun and interesting ways that you can test processing speed and reaction time, which actually are the most sensitive post-concussion. The hard part with that is, well, even with the SCAT or the SAC, there are not good norms. So sometimes I'll do a SAC and they'll come up with a 23 or whatever, but what does that mean for them in comparison to everyone else? So there's still more work, I think, that needs to be done in just the normative samples for those. But if you have the option of doing a baseline on a kid in any way and can do a comparison, you're always going to be better off. You know, any pediatrician who does a pre-participation examination and just does the VETs and does the SCAT is going to be helpful with the baseline versus not. Processing speed and reaction time are so sensitive though, they can vary quite a bit, so it's hard to hang your hat on them completely.
Please.
Well, along the lines of that, a conference I attended, sports concussion conference a few years ago.
Let me bring the microphone.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I should have been doing this anyway, so.
Sorry, I don't know what's last way. Well, I just got back from the sports concussion conference in Florida a few weeks ago. Anyways, they were saying that on some of those standardized things, there's not a baseline norms, but a change for the individual patient is reliable. So I think a drop of 1 point on the SAC or like 2 seconds on the King-David is statistically significant for an individual patient. So you can use those for baseline testing, but you need to have a baseline for kids because there are no normative data.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I mean, it's just time consuming. All of the families, I mean, baseline is a great idea, but you know how busy families get. And then when they come in and they have a concussion and never got their baseline, they were like, they're so upset that they didn't do it, but you know, something else came up. So it's hard to get them in there for baseline. So schools sometimes help with that, but anything, like the impact is fast and easy. Anything else you do that is balance or the King-David or whatever is time consuming one-on-one administration. But
One question, Karen, that I know came up earlier, it shared with me, was about driving. Iowa's a rural state. Many parts of Iowa don't have good public transportation, extracurricular events. Is there the potential to weave in some recommendations on RTD, return to driving, in future REAP publications?
good question. There is a one-pager on driving in Get Schooled on concussions. And in the clinic, like I said, we primarily use processing speed or the visual motor speed and reaction time. If those are below average, then we say you don't want to have them driving. Not only for their own safety, but if something were to happen in a court of law, and you'd have data that said they were compromised. So that's, you definitely don't want to go there. The problem is that how do we know these kids did not have slow processing speed or reaction time before the concussion, or with driving, because it's just a new thing in general. And if there's a question of ADHD or learning disabilities, that's where I see those to be somewhat low at baseline anyway. So you always have to take that into consideration. So we say, if at all possible, we'd say, I mean, if they're in the 1%, definitely don't. If they start to be able to come back in and have testing done to ask that question, frequently enough to make a change in that decision, and their scores are going up, we will start to entertain the idea. We will say to parents, we always think you still need to go out with them and do real-time driving. Make sure that their processing speed and reaction time is back to where you saw it for your own kid when you were teaching them to drive. And the reality is that just some kids, they couldn't get to PT, they couldn't get to school if they didn't drive. That's the same with adults. When we're seeing adults, we say, I'm going to let you know, here are your scores. If they're really low, I'm going to suggest you don't do it. But the reality is, life would stop for some of us if we couldn't drive. So some of that, we just have to say, go try it.
See, I think we should all be wearing our helmets when we're driving.
Do you take the impulse control score into consideration with the reaction time and visual motor speed at all, knowing that potentially someone just didn't try
Yes.
when you're talking about driving?
Yes. Do I take, I don't have to repeat the question because you have the mic. Yes, I do take the impulse control score into consideration as a validity marker. I also take the cognitive efficiency score into consideration as a measure of how balanced was their effort on this test, basically. And as a psychologist, one other step further is sometimes we use the driving as the carrot, as well as extracurricular activities. If you come back and you're asking me to give all kinds of academic accommodations, like call your teachers and ask for all these things in school, but you're going to all your extracurricular activities and you're driving and you're going to prom and all those other things, then that's just a behavioral thing. We just say, well, no to that. Extracurriculars are added back in. When you are able to be at school, stay at school, and do some of your homework, then you can consider a little bit of gradual extracurricular. So sometimes that is our leverage to get the academics back on track before we start to get the other parts. And you could probably imagine how quickly those things get better when you change the order of those.
Thank you. And I think we'll wrap up with this session. Karen is around this afternoon, and we'll do a bit of a wrap up at 3:30 with perhaps a few more